The cold bit through Staff Sergeant Daniel Cortland's coat like broken glass. January 9th, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes Forest, 3 miles southwest of Bastogne, Belgium. The trees stood skeletal against a sky the color of old iron. Snow had fallen during the night, muffling the world except for the distant thump of artillery that never really stopped. Cortland lay belly down in a shallow depression behind a fallen oak, his M1903A4 Springfield resting on a rotted branch. His right shoulder screamed where shrapnel had torn through 2 days earlier. Do you believe 2 soldiers alone could change the course of a battle? Comment what you would have done in their place, and subscribe to discover more forgotten stories from World War II. The battalion surgeon had packed it with sulfa and wrapped it tight, but every heartbeat sent fresh pain down his arm. He could still shoot. That was what mattered. The tremor in his left hand was worse. It had started after the mortar round landed 6 feet from his foxhole outside Foy. The explosion had killed Private Hernandez instantly and left Cortland deaf in his right ear. The tremor came and went. Right now it was there. A faint vibration he tried to ignore as he settled his breathing and watched the tree line 400 yards out. He was alone because everyone else was dead or pulled back. His spotter, Corporal Eddie Shaw, had taken a round through the throat that morning during the German push. Cortland had held pressure on the wound, while Shaw's eyes went wide and then empty. The rest of 3rd Platoon, Able Company, 2nd Battalion, had withdrawn under heavy fire when the Wehrmacht counterattack rolled through at dawn. Cortland had been separated, pushed north by a flanking squad. Now he was here, dug into this miserable fold of earth with 9 rounds left in his rifle and no radio. The Springfield was a good weapon. Bolt action, 30-06 Springfield cartridge, accurate out to 800 yards in the right hands. His hands had been right once. He had grown up in eastern Kentucky, hunting deer and turkey in the Daniel Boone National Forest with his father. Church every Sunday at First Baptist in Corbin. His mother made him memorize Psalms. He could still hear her voice. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The Germans appeared at 10 minutes past noon. Cortland saw them through his scope before he heard them. 12 men moving in a loose column along the logging road that cut through the valley below. Wehrmacht, not SS. Field gray uniforms, coal scuttle helmets, rifles slung or carried at the ready. One man in front carried an MP-40 submachine gun. Another had a radio pack. They moved carefully but not slowly. Experienced troops. They were heading east, which meant they would pass within 250 yards of his position. Cortland's breath formed small clouds in the frozen air. He forced himself to breathe slower, deeper. The cold made his ribs ache where the shrapnel had cracked bone. He settled the crosshairs on the lead man, the one with the MP-40, center mass. The Wehrmacht patrol was talking. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw mouths moving, the casual gestures of men who thought they were safe this far behind their own lines. They didn't know the American pocket was collapsing. They didn't know that a single sniper with a broken shoulder and a tremor in his hand was lying in the snow 240 yards away, deciding whether to pull the trigger. Cortland did not want to shoot. If he fired, they would know where he was. 12 against 1. He had 9 rounds. Even if every shot found its mark, which it wouldn't, he'd be overrun. If he let them pass, they would continue east toward the American lines. Whatever intelligence they carried, whatever orders they were moving to execute, would reach their destination. Men would die because he had stayed silent. He thought about Eddie Shaw bleeding out in the snow. He thought about Hernandez, who had carried a photograph of his daughter and talked about opening a garage in El Paso after the war. He thought about his mother and the words she had made him memorize. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." His finger rested on the trigger. The German with the MP-40 stopped and turned, saying something to the man behind him. Cortland could see his face clearly through the scope. Young, maybe 22, a thin scar above his left eye. Human. Cortland's hand trembled. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them, steadied his breathing. Then he pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound flat and hard in the cold air. The German with the MP40 dropped. The round had caught him high in the chest, just below the collarbone. He went down without a sound, folding onto the snow like a coat slipping off a chair. The others scattered immediately, no panic, just trained response. They moved off the road into the trees, taking cover, shouting. Cortland worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a fresh round. 8 left. He found another target. A soldier crouched behind a birch tree, trying to locate the shooter. Cortland put the crosshairs on his head and fired. The man's helmet flew off and he dropped. The patrol was returning fire now. Rifles barked, rounds snapping through the branches above Cortland's head. They didn't know exactly where he was yet. They were firing at the general direction, suppressing, buying time to flank. Cortland shifted position, moving 3 yards to his left, staying low. His shoulder protested with a sharp spike of pain that made his vision blur for a second. He ignored it. 7 rounds left. A soldier broke from cover, sprinting toward a fallen log closer to Cortland's position. Bad decision. Cortland tracked him, led him by a foot, squeezed. The round took him in the side and spun him around. He fell hard, not moving. 6 rounds. The Germans had stopped shooting. That was worse. It meant they were thinking, organizing. Cortland scanned the tree line. Movement. 2 men, moving fast through the underbrush, trying to circle around his right flank. He fired at the first one, missed. The round kicked up snow behind him. The soldiers dove for cover. 5 rounds. Cortland worked the bolt again, found the second soldier as he raised his head to look. He fired. The man jerked back and went still. 4 rounds. The Germans opened up again, concentrated fire now. They had his position. Rounds slammed into the oak trunk, chewed up the snow around him, whined off rocks. Cortland pressed himself flat, feeling the impacts through the frozen ground. He counted at least 4 rifles firing, maybe 5. That meant 7 or 8 still alive. 4 rounds would not be enough. He heard shouting in German. Orders. They were going to rush him. Standard tactic. Suppressing fire while a squad moved in close. He had maybe 30 seconds. Cortland looked to his left. The ground sloped down into a shallow ravine choked with deadfall and scrub. If he could reach it, he might break contact, slip away in the confusion. But that meant abandoning the position. It meant letting them pass, letting them report what they'd seen, letting them continue toward the American lines. He thought about the men in Able company. Boys, most of them. Farm kids and factory workers who'd never fired a shot in anger before they landed in France. They were falling back toward Bastogne under orders, under strength and undersupplied, holding a line that shouldn't hold. If this German patrol reached their objective, if they reported accurate positions or called in artillery, more of those boys would die. Cortland thought about Eddie Shaw, about Hernandez, about the young German with the scar above his eye. He thought about his father teaching him to shoot, about the quiet of the Kentucky woods before dawn. He thought about the psalm his mother had taught him. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. These heroes were erased from history, but here, their voices are heard again. Leave a like if you believe their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. The firing stopped. In the silence, Cortland heard boots crunching through snow. They were coming. He rose to one knee, ignoring the pain that lanced through his shoulder, and brought the rifle up. A German soldier appeared 20 yards away, moving fast, rifle raised. Cortland shot him through the chest, 3 rounds left. Another soldier, closer, swinging his weapon toward Cortland. He fired, hit him in the shoulder, spun him around but didn't drop him. The man fell behind a tree, shouting. 2 rounds. Cortland saw movement to his right, swung the rifle, but the soldier was already firing. The first round missed. The second caught Cortland in the side, just above his hip. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. He went down on his back, the Springfield falling from his hands. The world tilted. Sky, branches, Snow beginning to fall again, soft and silent. He couldn't breathe. His lungs wouldn't work. He tasted copper, blood in his mouth. Boots approached. Cortland turned his head, saw two Germans standing over him. One was bleeding from the shoulder wound, his face twisted with pain and rage. The other was older, maybe 35, a sergeant by his insignia. They were talking. Cortland couldn't understand the words. The older one knelt down, looked at Cortland's wounds, shook his head. The younger one raised his rifle, pointing it at Cortland's face. The sergeant said something sharp, a command. The younger one hesitated, then lowered the weapon. The sergeant looked at Cortland again. Their eyes met. Cortland saw no hatred there, just weariness. The sergeant stood, said something else to the younger soldier, and they moved away. Cortland lay in the snow, staring up at the sky. The pain was enormous, filling his chest and stomach, radiating out into his limbs. He tried to move his hand, couldn't. His fingers were numb. He could hear the Germans talking farther away now, regrouping, counting their dead. 5, maybe 6. Half their patrol gone because one American with a broken shoulder and a tremor in his hand had decided to fight. The snow fell harder. Cortland's vision began to narrow at the edges. He wondered if the Germans would come back, finish him. He wondered if anyone from Able Company would find him. He thought about his mother. She would get a telegram. "We regret to inform you." He tried to pray but couldn't form the words. His mind drifted. He was back in Kentucky, 10 years old, walking through the woods with his father on a cold November morning. The trees were bare, and the ground was frozen, and his breath made clouds in the air. His father carried an old Winchester and walked quietly, teaching him to move without sound, to see without being seen. His father had fought in the First War in France. He never talked about it. But sometimes at night, Cortland would hear him walking through the house, unable to sleep. Now Cortland understood. Now he knew what his father had carried home. The sound of boots again. Closer. Cortland forced his eyes open. A figure stood over him, silhouetted against the gray sky. American. An officer, Lieutenant Daniels from Baker Company. Behind him, more soldiers, rifles raised, moving past Cortland's position toward the tree line. Daniels knelt down, looked at Cortland's wounds. His face was grim. Cortland tried to speak, managed only a whisper. Daniels leaned closer. Cortland told him about the German patrol, about how many he'd killed, about the ones who were left. Daniels nodded, called for a medic, then stood and moved forward with his men. Cortland heard gunfire. Short, sharp bursts. Then silence. The medic arrived, a kid named Thompson, who looked about 18. He cut away Cortland's coat, packed the wounds, gave him morphine from a syringe. The pain receded, replaced by a warm, floating sensation. Thompson was talking, saying something about evacuation, about getting him to an aid station. Cortland closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was being carried on a stretcher. The sky was darker, evening coming on. He could see trees passing overhead, hear voices, feel the rough jostling of men moving fast over uneven ground. The morphine made everything distant and unreal. He drifted. When he woke next, he was in a tent, lying on a cot. Lanterns hung from the ridgepole. A surgeon was working on someone nearby, speaking in low tones to a nurse. Cortland tried to sit up, couldn't. His whole body felt like lead. A chaplain appeared beside him, a captain with silver crosses on his collar. He asked Cortland if he wanted to pray. Cortland nodded. The chaplain took his hand and began to speak. "The Lord is my shepherd." Cortland closed his eyes and listened. He thought about the German sergeant who had stopped the younger soldier from shooting him. He thought about the men he had killed. He thought about Eddie Shaw and Hernandez and all the others who would never go home. He thought about the cost of survival, the weight of every decision, the terrible clarity of knowing that doing the right thing often meant doing something that would haunt you forever. The chaplain finished the prayer and squeezed Cortland's hand. Cortland opened his eyes. The chaplain was young, maybe 28, with a thin face and kind eyes. He asked Cortland if there was anything he needed. Cortland thought about that. What did he need? Absolution? Forgiveness? A reason that made sense of the blood and the cold and the endless fear? He shook his head. The chaplain stayed a moment longer, then moved to the next cot. Cortland lay in the dim light, listening to the sounds of the aid station, men groaning, nurses moving quietly, the distant rumble of artillery that never stopped. He wondered if he would ever sleep without hearing Eddie Shaw's voice, without seeing the young German's face in his scope. He wondered if his mother's prayers had kept him alive, or if it was just luck, just the random chance of one bullet missing and another finding its mark. He wondered if any of it mattered. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The war continued. Men continued to die. And Daniel Cortland lay on a cot in a tent in Belgium, broken and alive, carrying a weight he would never put down. But this was not the end of his story. And what happened in the hours that followed would reveal something darker and more terrible than anything he had yet faced. Something that would force him to confront not just the enemy in the trees, but the enemy within himself, and make a choice that would echo across the lives of everyone who survived that frozen winter. The surgeon came for him at dawn. Major Reynolds, a thin man with steady hands and exhausted eyes who had been operating for 36 hours straight. He examined Cortland's wounds without speaking, probing the entry hole above his hip with careful fingers. Cortland gritted his teeth against the pain. The morphine had worn off hours ago, and they were rationing what remained. Reynolds stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel that was more red than white. He told Cortland he was lucky. The round had passed through without hitting anything vital. Broken ribs, torn muscle, significant blood loss. But he would live. Reynolds said they were moving him to a field hospital in Bastogne within the hour. Cortland nodded. He tried to sit up, and the world spun. Reynolds put a hand on his shoulder, told him to stay down. Then the major moved to the next patient, and Cortland was alone again with his thoughts. They loaded him onto a truck at 7:30. 6 other wounded men lay on stretchers in the bed, wrapped in blankets, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The truck lurched forward, grinding through snow and ice, every bump sending fresh waves of pain through Cortland's side. No one spoke. One man, a private with burns covering half his face, stared at the canvas roof with unblinking eyes. Another mumbled continuously, words that made no sense, his hands clutching at invisible things. Cortland closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but couldn't. His mind kept returning to the German sergeant, to the moment their eyes had met. Why had he spared him? Professional courtesy? Mercy? Or had he simply not wanted to waste a bullet on a dying man? Cortland would never know. The truck hit a deep rut, and someone cried out. The driver shouted an apology. They continued east toward Bastogne. The field hospital occupied what had been a schoolhouse on the southern edge of the town. The building had taken shelling. Part of the roof was gone, replaced with canvas tarps. Inside, the corridors were lined with wounded men on stretchers, waiting. The air smelled of blood and disinfectant and something else, something sweet and rotten that Cortland recognized as gangrene. Nurses moved between the stretchers, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, marking foreheads with grease pencils. Triage, sorting the men who might live from those who wouldn't. Cortland was carried to a classroom that had been converted into a ward, 20 cots, most occupied. A nurse took his information, checked his wounds, gave him water. She told him a doctor would see him when possible. Then she moved on. Cortland lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling where someone had painted a mural of the American flag. The stars were crooked and some of the stripes had run, but it was there, defiant. If you also feel moved by real stories from World War II, join our community. Turn on the notification bell and tell us in the comments which country's story impressed you the most. Lieutenant Daniels found him that afternoon. The officer looked worse than Cortland remembered. His face was gray with fatigue, and there was dried blood on his collar. He pulled up a chair beside Cortland's cot and sat down heavily. He told Cortland that Baker Company had engaged the remaining Germans from the patrol. They had killed 3 more and captured 2. The rest had escaped into the forest. But the Germans they'd captured had been carrying maps, detailed maps, showing American positions around Bastogne. If that patrol had reached their lines, if those maps had been delivered, the Wehrmacht would have known exactly where to hit. Daniel said Cortland's action had probably saved 50 lives, maybe more. He said he was putting him in for a silver star. Cortland said nothing. Daniels watched him for a moment, then asked if he was all right. Cortland said he was fine. Daniels didn't believe him but didn't press. He squeezed Cortland's shoulder, stood, and left. That night, Cortland dreamed. He was back in the snow behind the fallen oak, watching the German patrol through his scope. But this time when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. He worked the bolt, tried again. Nothing. The Germans kept walking. He screamed at them to stop, but no sound came out. They walked past him, walked through him like he was made of smoke, walked toward the American lines carrying their maps and their orders. He tried to stand, to follow, but his legs wouldn't move. He looked down and saw blood spreading across the snow, more blood than any body could hold. He was dissolving into it, becoming part of the red stain. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering. The ward was dark except for a single lantern by the door. Someone nearby was moaning softly. Cortland lay still, waiting for his breathing to slow. The dream had felt more real than memory. The next morning, a chaplain came through the ward. Not the same one from the aid station. This one was older, a major with grey hair and a lined face. He stopped at each cot, speaking quietly with the men, offering prayer or simply listening. When he reached Cortland, he introduced himself as Chaplain Harris from the 101st Airborne. He asked Cortland if he wanted to talk. Cortland said he didn't. Harris nodded, didn't push, but he sat down anyway. He said he'd been in the First War, in the Argonne. He said he understood what it meant to kill a man up close, to see his face, to carry that face with you forever. He said God understood too. Cortland looked at him. He asked if God understood why good men had to die while he got to live. Harris was quiet for a long time. Then he said that some questions didn't have answers, at least not answers that made sense in the moment. He said faith wasn't about understanding. It was about trust. About believing that even in the darkness, even in the valley of death, there was something larger at work. Cortland wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that Eddie Shaw's death had meaning, that Hernandez's sacrifice mattered, that the young German with the scar had died for something more than just geography and politics. But belief was hard, harder than pulling a trigger, harder than lying in the snow with a bullet in your side. Harris seemed to read his thoughts. He said belief didn't come easy to anyone who'd seen what war really was. He said doubt was natural, even necessary. He said the men who troubled him most were the ones who felt nothing, who killed without question and slept without dreams. Those men, Harris said, had lost something essential. Cortland asked what that was. Harris said their humanity, their ability to recognize the divine spark in others, even their enemies. He said Cortland's struggle, his guilt, his questions, those were signs that he hadn't lost that spark, that he was still fully human, that there was still hope for him. After Harris left, Cortland thought about those words, still fully human, as if humanity was something that could be measured, something you could lose piece by piece until nothing remained but a shell that looked like a man but wasn't. He thought about the soldiers he'd seen, the ones with dead eyes who followed orders without feeling. He thought about the private with burns on his face, staring at nothing. He thought about himself, about the tremor in his hand, about the dreams that came every night. Was he still fully human? Or had he crossed some line out there in the snow, some invisible border between what was necessary and what was unforgivable? He didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. On the third day, they told him he was being evacuated to England. His wounds were healing, but he needed surgery to repair the damage to his abdomen, and the field hospital lacked the resources. A C-47 was flying out that evening, carrying wounded back to a hospital in Southampton. Cortland would be on it. He asked about returning to his unit. The doctor, a captain named Foster, shook his head. He said Cortland's war was over. Even after surgery, even after rehabilitation, he wouldn't be fit for combat duty. The shrapnel in his shoulder had damaged nerves. The tremor would likely be permanent. Foster said he was going home. Cortland lay back on his cot, going home, to Kentucky, to his mother's house and his father's silence, to a place where no one would understand what he'd seen, what he'd done, to a life that would never again feel quite real. If you also feel moved by real stories from World War II, join our community. Turn on the notification bell and tell us in the comments which country's story impressed you the most. They loaded him onto the C-47 just before dark. The plane was packed with wounded, men on stretchers stacked 3 high, men with missing limbs and ruined faces and injuries that wouldn't heal. The engines roared and the aircraft lifted, climbing through the winter sky. Cortland looked out the small window beside his stretcher. Below, he could see Bastogne. Smoke rising from a dozen fires, the snow around the town churned brown and red. The Ardennes Forest stretched in every direction, dark and endless. Somewhere down there, men were still fighting, still dying, still making impossible choices. The plane banked west, and the view disappeared. Cortland closed his eyes. He thought about the German sergeant one more time. He wondered if that man had made it home, if he was haunted by the same ghosts. He wondered if they would ever meet again, if there would ever be a reckoning. He suspected not. War didn't work that way. War scattered men like seeds, and what grew from that scattering was rarely what anyone intended. The flight took 6 hours. Cortland drifted in and out of consciousness, the drone of the engines and the morphine pulling him under. When he woke, they were descending. Through the window, he saw the lights of Southampton spread below, bright and impossible after so many months of blackout conditions. The plane touched down, rough, bounced once, settled. They unloaded the wounded into waiting ambulances. Cortland was taken to a military hospital on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling compound of Quonset huts and converted warehouses. He was given a clean bed, hot food, a full dose of morphine. For the first time in weeks, the pain receded completely. He slept for 14 hours straight and woke to find a nurse checking his vitals. She smiled, told him he was doing well, asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. She left. Cortland stared at the ceiling. The tremor in his hand was still there. Surgery came 5 days later. They opened him up, removed fragments of cloth and metal that had been driven into his abdomen, repaired torn muscle, closed him with 47 stitches. When he woke in recovery, a different nurse was there. This one older, with kind eyes and a Scottish accent. She told him the surgery had gone well. She told him he was lucky. Everyone told him he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and not replaced. The nurse asked if she could get him anything. He asked for a Bible. She brought one an hour later, old and worn, the pages thin as tissue. Cortland opened it to Psalms, found the 23rd, read it slowly. The words were familiar but distant, like something heard through water. He read it again and again, looking for comfort, for meaning, for some assurance that what he'd done was right. The words stared back at him, black marks on white paper offering nothing. Weeks passed. His body healed. The wounds closed. The pain faded to a dull ache. His strength returned. But the tremor remained. And the dreams. Every night he was back in the snow. Every night he pulled the trigger. Sometimes the faces changed. Sometimes it was Eddie Shaw in his scope, or Hernandez, or his father. Sometimes it was himself. He would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, the taste of copper in his mouth. The doctors said it would get better with time. They said his mind needed to heal, just like his body. They gave him pills that made him sleep, but didn't stop the dreams. They suggested he talk to a psychiatrist. He refused. What would he say? That he'd done his duty? That he'd saved lives? That he would do it again if he had to? All of that was true, and none of it made the faces go away. In March, they told him he was going home. Medical discharge, honorable, a Purple Heart, and a Silver Star. a train ticket to Kentucky, and a small pension. He packed his few belongings into a duffel bag, shook hands with the doctors and nurses who had cared for him, and walked out of the hospital into a cold English rain. The train south was crowded with soldiers, most of them heading for the docks, for the ships that would carry them home. Cortland sat by a window and watched the countryside pass. Green fields, stone walls, villages untouched by war. It seemed impossible that such places existed, that life could simply continue while men died in frozen forests. But it did. It always had. The train reached Southampton. He boarded a troop ship, a converted liner that stank of diesel and unwashed bodies. The crossing took 8 days. Cortland spent most of it on deck, watching the grey Atlantic roll past, trying not to think about anything. They docked in New York on a bright April morning. The city rose before them, enormous and gleaming, impossibly alive. Cortland stood at the rail with 1,000 other soldiers, watching the Statue of Liberty pass to starboard. Some men cheered, some wept. Cortland felt nothing. They processed through Fort Hamilton, collected their papers, their pay, their separation orders. Cortland took a bus to Grand Central, bought a ticket to Kentucky, and sat in the cavernous terminal for 6 hours waiting for his train. He watched people hurry past, civilians in clean clothes carrying briefcases and shopping bags, living lives that had nothing to do with war. He wondered if he would ever be one of them, if he would ever be able to walk through a crowd without scanning for threats, without calculating fields of fire, without feeling the weight of the rifle that wasn't there. The train carried him south through the night. He slept badly, woke often, stared out the window at darkened towns and empty fields. They reached Kentucky in the morning. Corbin Station was small and quiet. He stepped off the train with his duffel bag and stood on the platform, breathing air that smelled like pine and spring rain. Home. The word felt strange. His mother was waiting by the station entrance, her face older than he remembered, her eyes red from crying. She held him carefully, mindful of his injuries, and said his name over and over. His father stood behind her, silent, his face unreadable. They drove home in the old Ford pickup, no one speaking. The house looked smaller. The woods behind it seemed darker. Inside, his mother had prepared a meal, fried chicken and biscuits and greens. She fussed over him, asking about his wounds, his health, his plans. His father sat at the table and said almost nothing. That night, Cortland lay in his childhood bed and listened to the sounds of the house. His mother washing dishes, his father walking from room to room, unable to settle. The creak of boards, the whisper of wind through the eaves, familiar sounds that should have been comforting but weren't. He closed his eyes and immediately saw the German with the scar falling in the snow. He opened them again, stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. At 2 a.m, he got up and walked outside. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the yard. He walked into the woods, following the path he'd walked 1,000 times as a boy. The trees rose around him, silent and still. He walked until he reached the clearing where his father had taught him to shoot, where he'd killed his first deer at age 12. He stood in the center of the clearing and closed his eyes. He thought about the German sergeant, about the choice that man had made to spare him when he could have finished it. He thought about his own choices, the ones he'd made in the snow, the ones he would make again if he had to. He thought about Eddie Shaw and Hernandez and all the others who hadn't come home. He thought about the weight of survival, the guilt of living when so many had died. He thought about his mother's prayers and Chaplain Harris's words about humanity and faith. He thought about what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be a man, what it meant to live with blood on your hands. And slowly, standing in that moonlit clearing, he understood something. The faces would never go away. The dreams would never stop. The tremor would never fade. He would carry the war with him for the rest of his life. That was the price. That was the cost. And it was a cost he would pay, because the alternative was to forget. To let those men die for nothing. To lose the thing that made him human. The moon set. Dawn began to break, pink and gold through the trees. Cortland opened his eyes and looked at his hands. They were steady. The tremor was gone, at least for now. He took a deep breath, held it, let it out slowly. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, toward his mother and father, toward whatever life remained. Behind him, the forest stood silent in the growing light, and somewhere in that silence, carried on the wind that moved through the bare branches, were the voices of all the men who had walked into the valley of death and never walked out. They would be with him always. Witnesses, companions, ghosts who would never let him forget what he had seen, what he had done, what he had survived. And perhaps, in their presence, in the weight of their memory, he would find a way to live, not as he had been, but as he was now, broken and whole, haunted and human. A man who had faced the darkness and come back carrying pieces of it inside him, pieces he would never put down, pieces that would forever mark him as someone who understood the true cost of courage and the terrible grace of survival.